The Straussian Betrayal of Leo Strauss. Relatively brief intervention to highlight a phenomenon that has unfolded over the past few years. What has happened is that prominent scholars and legions of followers have read Leo Strauss as attempting to save modern science, save, therefore, modern rationalism. On these people's reading, Leo Strauss was not altogether sympathetic to Nietzsche's critique of modern rationalism, of modern science. Why? Well, because it leads to nihilism. According to Nietzsche, there had been an evolution from Socrates all the way down to positivism, modern science ultimately, and this would lead to nihilism, which is to say, the recognition that all values are ungrounded, that they're based on the absence of truth, the absence of the good. Now, Leo Strauss did highlight inadequacies in Nietzsche. However, he did recognize that there was something right about Nietzsche. It turns out that contemporary Straussians, by and large, get the story wrong. They invert the terms. So what is right in Nietzsche, they take to be wrong. What is wrong in Nietzsche, they take to be right. Now, what has happened? Well, they have clung to mechanistic science. They have rejected, however, Nietzsche's appeal to the dark. They said, no, you have to shut up, Nietzsche. You're going too far. We have to keep modern mechanistic science and rationalism because otherwise we can't continue living as a civilization, as a society, as a nation. So we need that. What we don't need is your spilling the beans. That's too much. That's going too far. We'll keep that for a few people who can enjoy that, but most people will resent that move. Most people will pay dire consequences for it. So we want to keep the monster in the closet, and we keep going as modern rationalists. Right? So we'll establish beautiful, maybe not so beautiful, democracies where everybody can hide their skeletons in the closet, and we don't have to face World War III and total annihilation or another Holocaust. So these are the terms. In reality, Leo Strauss sees that a return to early modernism or early modern rationalism is impossible. What has happened is that early modernity has unfolded. And yes, Nietzsche spilled the beans, but it was inevitable, given the premise. In other words, modern rationalism is progressing toward the exposition of its presuppositions. The so-called infinite progress is a carrot for donkeys. In reality, what we're doing is moving toward the revelation of the beginning. And Heidegger, following Nietzsche, understood that element, although he projected it over human nature as a whole, over the human experience as a whole, and so extended it and embraced Socrates, Plato, and the whole Platonic tradition within the scope of this logic of unfoldment. Well, while it is the case that there is no progress without a form, and so all progress presupposes what we would call perhaps the a formal cause, so that it does not leave that formal cause, but it works that cause out, as it were, so remains within the beginning. It is not the case that what we have as the phenomenon of nihilism that Nietzsche, as well as Dostoevsky and others in the 20th century decried, unfolds out of classical and medieval rationalism. So, what does Strauss, in effect, in the concrete, propose? He proposes, and this should be obvious, and alas, it is not, to most people who call themselves or think of themselves as Straussians. What did he propose? He returned to medieval rationalism. And so classical medieval rationalism, or classical rationalism as professed, as practiced, as lived out by medievals such as, most notably, Maimonides. And Strauss makes this very clear at the end of his preface to Spinoza's critique, as well as elsewhere, all over the place, really. So it is a great irony that contemporary Straussians wind up being what Leo Strauss calls neo-Epicureans. So we go from Thomas Pangol to Mansfield in Harvard and Zuckert and just about everyone involved in the interpretation journal nowadays, not under the old direction, but under the new direction. So what we have is a complete reversal of Strauss's position. Instead of seeing Strauss as understanding that modern rationalism has reached its bankruptcy, not because the bankruptcy is something novel that we can avert on the basis of the foundations of modern rationalism or the beginning of modern rationalism, but because it is something that has been brought out of it. What our new Straussians are arguing is that Strauss is really accepting the foundations of modern science and of modern rationalism. And he's saying, well, just keep it quiet. And we can build a new society. We can manage perhaps our democracies, our new republics, whatever, our polities, on the basis of these mechanistic principles. So evolutionism is fine, right? And evolutionism being a term that it's a correlative of, in the natural sciences, of historicism for the social sciences. Now, this is to be completely blind to Strauss's actual position. Strauss himself says, when positivism, which is essentially modern science, sees itself in the mirror, it recognizes itself as historicism. Now, mechanistic reason, instrumental reason, is ultimately historicistic. Now, it is the case that early modern rationalism is political in a way that later rationalism is not. So it retains common sense, but this common sense it is destroying. In the course of the unfolding of the modern world, we have seen a dramatic and progressive erosion of common sense. And so the alienation of reason from the common experience of man, and so we've seen a corruption, even a destruction, an erosion of the imagination. So can we go back to that first step? Well, Strauss, why does Strauss go back to, why does he go back to Machiavelli? Well, he goes back to Machiavelli to show us that, look, this is how we got here. At the beginning, it looked pretty decent. Although there were people who were saying, watch out. Teacher of evil, there's This is all very hypothetical. There's nothing certain about our fact-value distinction and so forth, right? So Strauss is saying, well, wait a second. We take things for granted. In our current situation, we see what we believe in, our certainties, right? We take for granted. We don't question our certainties. Right? Well, if we go back to the beginning of modern rationalism, we see that our science, our today's science, is based on pillars that we have already semi-rejected. So the early modern rationalists were asserting things that we no longer do assert. Now, how can we go back to that? We can no longer go back to Machiavelli to the extent that we can no longer go back to Newton. We can extrapolate elements from him, but we're not going to stick to the whole package. And this is what people have been doing, new Straussians have been doing. They've been extrapolating elements from Machiavelli and say, well, we repackage him and we'll recycle him and we'll make him work for our present day as Rome burns. This is not at all what Strauss said. Leo Strauss was absolutely not a Machiavellian, and he was not trying to save modern science or modern rationalism. He saw it as bankrupt. He did acknowledge that whatever traces or vestiges there were, we could, throwing them out of the window would be ridiculous, but the only way you could come out of total annihilation was by reverting to medieval rationalism, which meant classical rationalism in the light of revelation. So there was biblical revelation. We live in 2023 BC, AD, and so we can call it current common era, right? But that would be simply a cover-up, a travesty. So we obviously live in the light of Christianity. And he says, well, you have to embrace that point, that reality. And now what this means is that you can't be simply a Platonist as Plato, but you can be a Platonist in the light of revelation. How do you get back to that? Well, you have to, at this point, do some homework and embrace also the exposure, the Nietzschean exposure of the bankruptcy of modern reason. You do this not by accepting that there is no reason at all, but that there are alternatives. So that's what Strauss stood for, and given what we have today, there's a slight problem. We have a betrayal of all that Strauss stood for.